In our region, the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes, we continue to face many crises and natural calamities. Kenya, in collaboration with other member states, regional organizations, and the UN, provides political leadership towards resolving some of these very complex challenges. Specifically, Kenya has taken a leading role in championing peace in Eastern DRC through the EAC-led Nairobi process. We are keen to work with all international partners to restore peace and security in the Sudan. Somalia provides an opportunity to act in concert to consolidate gains made since the deployment of AMISOM in 2007. Kenya is proud of the United Nations offices in Nairobi and has invested heavily in the UN complex and Gigiri area's infrastructure. I call upon the leadership of the UN to strengthen the United Nations office in Nairobi to effectively extend its services to the Global South. We already demonstrate this goodwill in the ongoing renovation of the UNON Blocks A to J, and we hope that upon completion, the state-of-the-art complex will be an iconic model at the status of other UN headquarters in the Global North, improving the delivery of its programs. I invite all of you to take advantage of the various hubs in Kenya to enhance efficiency and effectiveness in achieving your mandate. Mr. Secretary General, I have told you earlier that whenever you speak our language, and you are our voice on the two most important items that the Global South faces. Number one is the subject of climate change. We believe that it is time for us as humanity to appreciate the existential threat that climate change poses, not to any particular country, any particular region, but to humanity in its entirety. And the urgent need to reconfigure what can be done, what everybody can do to deal with this challenge. We have taken the position as people from the Global South that it is not enough for us to say we didn't contribute much. It is not enough for us to say we are victims. We must proactively begin to offer what we consider our contribution in solving this problem, however it was created, by whomever it was created. I think it is now our collective responsibility to find the solution. And Mr. Secretary General, I want to tell the UN family here, because we believe in you, that Africa, indeed the Global South, we have ideas, we have suggestions, we believe we can be part, and we should be part of the solution. It is now a foregone conclusion that we have to change the trajectory from development fueled by fossil fuels to green energy growth. It's a foregone conclusion. I think we are beyond the Rubicon. And therefore, it is important that we find, where do we find the next energy to power world development? And we are making an offer that we have the largest resources of renewable energy. Kenya's grid is 92% renewable. That's just an example. We have huge resources in hydro, solar, wind, geothermal, and we are prepared and ready to make these resources available to solve this existential threat of climate change. All we are asking is that while we offer these resources, others should come with finances and technology so that we meet halfway and we get a win-win outcome. I think that is the proposition that we will be consolidating as leaders from the Global South and in our continent of Africa as we come to the UN General Assembly and as we go to the COP28.
Africa was a double victim of colonialism. First of all, because of colonialism itself. And I'm particularly at ease because I come from a colonialist country. But second, because when the institutions that are today the pillars of multilateralism, the UN, the Bretton Woods institutions were created, the African countries were not yet independent. They were not there. Their voice could not be heard. And so they were not represented, and today they remain dramatically underrepresented. Underrepresented in the UN, where there is still not one single African permanent member of the Security Council, which is something that is profoundly unfair and needs to be corrected, but also clearly underrepresented in the Bretton Woods institutions and other international institutions that were created to manage the global economy. And this, again, is something that a serious effort of reform must be able to correct. And I wanted to tell you that the United Nations is there to represent all nations of the world. But I believe that my role as Secretary General is to assume what is the need to address the dramatic inequalities that exist and to give the Global South the opportunities that the Global South requires in order to be able to catch up as quickly as possible, as it is absolutely essential for a matter of justice in our world. And climate change is the best example of that. As you said, Africa had a very small contribution to climate change, but many African countries are in the front line of the impacts. Floods, droughts, many other aspects. And this is a factor not only of poverty, in some situations of hunger, but a factor of instability. One of the reasons why the Sahel has witnessed such a progression of terrorist forces is exactly because of the impacts of climate change. It's not the only reason, but it is an accelerator of all the other reasons that are creating so many factors of instability within the African continent and other parts of the world. And indeed, the drama is that independently of everything that is being said, we need to dramatically reduce emissions this decade, and the emissions are still growing. And 80% of the emissions are of G20 countries, developed countries and large emerging economies. It's not Kenya, once again. In this case, Portugal also has a very small contribution. But the truth is, those countries have the responsibility, and it's good to see that Kenya is also ready to assume that responsibility, to dramatically reduce emissions this decade if we want to rescue the planet and if we want to make it still possible to get to an increase of 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. Unfortunately, we are not there. Developed countries are not doing enough, emerging economies are not doing enough, and we have proposed the Climate Solidarity Pact, in which both would assume more ambitious targets, and at the same time, developed countries would be able to provide the forms of financial and technological support for emerging economies to be able to accelerate their own transition into renewables and other forms of the green economy. And on the other hand, the climate change is there, and you witnessed that with the drought that you faced. And so, as you mentioned, adaptation, loss and damage, all these are crucial aspects in relation to which we have not yet found adequate answers. Adaptation is still not getting 50% of climate finance, and the loss and damage, let's keep our fingers crossed to make sure that it becomes a reality before the next COP in the Emirates. We live in a world in which we face dramatic inequalities, and inequalities that have been rising, inequalities among different people, but inequalities among different countries. Looking at the last few years, I was, many decades ago, Prime Minister of Portugal. And I imagine what it is to be Prime Minister of Portugal and what it is to be President of Kenya at the present moment. The COVID came. Portugal had a very easy access to vaccines and managed to fully vaccinate its population in a record time. African countries had an enormous difficulty to have access to vaccines, and even when African countries gathered the money needed to buy them, they were not available in the market. Then we had to recover from COVID. And the Prime Minister of Portugal had the support of the European Union, and the European Union printed a lot of money. The United States printed a lot of money, and all developed countries in the world printed a lot of money. I don't think in Kenya there was a possibility to print a lot of money without completely ruining your currency. And when, in the developed world, so much money was printed, that was one of the causes, not the most important one, but one of the causes of the progressive rise in inflation that, after the invasion of the Ukraine, became quite dramatic. And when inflation grows, interest rates grow. And when interest rates grow, a country like Kenya has to pay a heavy price. You couldn't print money, but you are paying the consequences, at least partial consequences, and the money that others probably have printed a little bit too much. Then, my dear friend Kristalina Georgieva, that is very concerned with the problems of the countries and the economies at that moment, was able to convince her board and to print in a different way the special drawing rights. The special drawing rights, thanks to her initiative, and I'd like to praise her courage, pushing for it, but there was one thing she couldn't change, the rules of distribution. So the Prime Minister of Portugal witnessed that the countries of the European Union, of which Portugal is a member, have received 160 billion US dollars for a population of a little bit less than 500 million people. Kenya, the President of Kenya, your predecessor at the time, was part of an African continent with more than 3 times, close to 3 times, the population of the European Union, and that received a total of 34 billion US dollars. And the least developed countries, that represent about 800 million people, almost double the population of the European Union, $17 billion. And we all know that reallocation has been a very complicated thing to put in place. And then, obviously, even if Portugal has a debt that is higher as a percentage of GDP than the debt of Kenya, it is still possible for Portugal to go to the markets and get credit in its own currency with interest rates, I don't know the last figures, but probably around 4%, and for some time below 0. And for several years in the recent crisis, until the last inflation surge, around 1%. I think Kenya has a different story. You have a lower debt as a percent of GDP than Portugal, but the president of Kenya, when he tries to look into how the markets will respond to their need of financing, is much more difficult to find credit, and will find it at interest rates much higher. I don't know exactly if it is 12, 13, or 15%, but it is much higher. So this is the situation we have in the world. And I compare my own country with your own country. It is clear that my own country benefits from an international financial system and an international financial architecture that is biased, that is dysfunctional, and that is deeply unfair. And so your quest for reform is a perfectly understandable one, and something that we must do everything to achieve. By coincidence, we'll be discussing tomorrow afternoon a draft for what I hope will be presented in the next few weeks in the UN to all member states, with a policy brief on the reform of the international financial system in the context of preparation of the so-called Summit of the Future, or of our common agenda, as we name the set of initiatives in which we are involved, covering many other aspects, the digital compact, the problems of the agenda for peace, but as an essential focus on the questions related to how to address the dramatic structural inequalities that are embedded in the way our financial system. We, as United Nations, we have not the power, a secretariat and agencies, and we have not the resources to change these things. But one thing you can be absolutely sure, we will be at your side. We will be together with the Global South, fighting for a world that is more based on justice, on fairness, a world where all women and men can have access to the same opportunities. It will not be immediate, but one thing needs to be done immediately. It's to reverse the trend that is amplifying inequalities and that is making our Agenda 2030 and the Agenda 2063 of the African Union becoming a dream instead of a reality. We still are on time to start reversing this trend, but that needs a lot of courage, and that needs those that today have the power to understand that it is better to share their power and the resources than to face a world that will be condemned to climate havoc and to more instability, more conflict, more wars, which means that nobody will benefit from it. You can count on our solidarity because it's the right thing to do and because we are all citizens of the world and sons and daughters of the same God. Thank you very much. We have many host countries, and I'm grateful to all of them. But I have no doubt in saying that you are the best host country for UN activities in the world. Gratitude, but also admiration. I am deeply moved by what has been the extraordinary leadership of Kenya and your personal extraordinary leadership in the difficult moments the region has known in the last years, and particularly in the last months and weeks, with a permanent initiative and a permanent commitment to lead the African solution for the African problems that surround you. Ethiopia has known a devastating civil war. Kenya had an absolutely central role in creating the conditions for a peace process that we all believe will lead to a positive solution for all the Ethiopian problems. When one sees today the tragedy of Sudan, it is clear your personal leadership, together with the countries of IGAD, together with the African Union, and we are fully ready to support it in trying to make sense of this horrible situation in which two leaders are fighting each other and destroying their own country. And again, Kenya is in the front line of addressing the problem and doing everything to solve it. In the DRC, and in the DRC we have MONUSCO, and we know how difficult it is to operate in the DRC. And we are extremely grateful for what has been the Kenyan initiative, the Nairobi process, and the courage of Kenya sending Kenyan military in a very, very, I would say, dangerous situation, not waiting for financial support, not waiting for equipment or for whatever. You have sent a group of troops that has performed, together with your political initiative, almost a miracle. We have seen the M23 at the doors of Goma, and we know Goma is safe, and the M23 is slowly retreating. Things have calmed down. Problem is not solved. But we know that Kenya is in the front line to address it and to help to solve it, because the Democratic Republic of Congo people need and deserve peace more than anyone else in the world. I visited Somalia many times, and I know the very important role that Kenya has always played in relation to the stabilization of Somalia and in relation to the fight against terrorism in this part of the world. And I could go on and on with South Sudan, with your active diplomacy with Eritrea, probably one of the most complex diplomatic efforts ever made by an African head of state. Indeed, I have to say that what Kenya is doing and what you are doing is a remarkable example of how we are able in the world to solve problems, to bring peace, and to address the dramatic conflicts that we all face and are having such negative consequences in relation to the stability and the economy of the whole world. We, as United Nations, we have not the power, a secretariat and agencies, and we have not the resources to change these things. But one thing you can be absolutely sure, we will be at your side. We will be together with the Global South, fighting for a world that is more based on justice, on fairness, a world where all women and men can have access to the same opportunities. It will not be immediate, but one thing needs to be done immediately. It's to reverse the trend that is amplifying inequalities and that is making our Agenda 2030 and the Agenda 2063 of the African Union becoming a dream instead of a reality. We still are on time to start reversing this trend, but that needs a lot of courage, and that needs those that today have the power to understand that it is better to share their power and the resources than to face a world that will be condemned to climate havoc and to more instability, more conflict, more wars, which means that nobody will benefit from it. You can count on our solidarity because it's the right thing to do and because we are all citizens of the world and sons and daughters of the same God. Thank you very much.